you.
Thank you for the chance to be here with you all this day. It's good to be back in New York. Some of you know that I actually went to college here, right up the street, 30 years ago, many years back. Was a freshman that started at Columbia University, and during my time there, I spent the first 3 years out of my 4 years there looking for a church. It was at a time 30 years ago when there were very few dynamic, growing churches in the city of New York. There were a handful, but you had to drive out to Flushing, you had to come downtown, and to see this kind of movement with the breadth and the type of churches and the commitment to the gospel and the way that New York City is experiencing revival, that's a very strong encouragement for me personally. Having experienced a kind of a dry time when I was here looking for churches. I was thankfully very involved with InterVarsity at Columbia, but just seeing the growth of the churches and the movement here, it's a very exciting thing to see. I want to talk about a new imagination that is needed for the ministry in the city, whether it's church planting or reviving older churches, a new imagination that is needed. And in order to do that, to talk about a new imagination, I want to talk about the problems with the old imagination. But here's one example of this. There's a book by Vincent Miller called Consuming Religion. Excellent book about how we have commercialized faith and religion in American society. And he uses this brilliant example about the Red campaign that was launched about 10 years ago, I believe. Y'all remember the Red campaign? It was launched with this massive Super Bowl ad. It was during one of the major Super Bowls, and they had pictures of Brad Pitt, Angelina, what's her name? Tom Hanks and Bono, of course. And they had all these Hollywood A-listers getting on there about this great new campaign that they were launching with the Super Bowl ad called the Red campaign. Now, the goal of the Red campaign was to address the problem of the AIDS pandemic specifically in sub-Saharan Africa. That was the stated goal. And the way you were going to fight the AIDS pandemic in sub-Saharan Africa was by buying products that were red. Apple iPods that were remember the iPod? Apple iPods that were red. Shirts at Target that were red. Jeans from Levi's that had the red tag on them, which means all jeans from Levi's. So you had all this kind of movement to purchase products to help stop the AIDS pandemic in sub-Saharan Africa. They spent $10 million on this campaign. Advertising Weekly tracked what they did. They spent $10 million. After 10 years of running the campaign, how much money did they raise? $10 million. So how much money did they actually raise? Zero. Nothing. They raised nothing. But here's the problem. They were trying to address the problem of the AIDS pandemic in sub-Saharan Africa with the very imagination and narrative that created the problems in the first place. Here's the problem with the AIDS pandemic in sub-Saharan Africa. It's actually not a cure. This might be controversial. But we actually have some semblance of a cure for AIDS in the world right now. How do I know this? Because about 25 years ago, I was sitting, actually Steve, you might have been there, it was my buddy Steve, we were in seminary together. We would go to this nearby Chili's where they would have 50-cent fajita night. And they expected you to buy like $5 beers. We would have water and our 4 or 5 50-cent fajitas. It was a cheap night out for seminary students. And I remember sitting there at the Chili's and watching television in the background, and an announcement came on television. It was a special news bulletin. And the news bulletin was Magic Johnson. Magic Johnson gets on television, and he says before a national televised audience, I have the HIV/AIDS virus, and I'm going to have to retire from basketball. Y'all remember that? Yeah, it was like, you know, when the shuttle blew up and all these things. I remember that moment so vividly because there we were at Chili's near Gordon Conwell in Massachusetts watching Magic Johnson announce that he was HIV/AIDS positive. Now, those of you who remember that moment, what was your first thought about Magic? He's dead. He's dead. Maybe a month, maybe a year, but man, he was a great ball player, but too bad he's not going to live much longer because AIDS pandemic meant that a diagnosis meant it was a death sentence. Now, what has happened to Magic over the last 25 years? He's very healthy. He's looking a little chunky, if you ask me. Magic Johnson has survived for 25 plus years with an HIV/AIDS diagnosis. Why? Because he's got great health insurance. And he has the money to buy the cocktail, the medical cocktail that has allowed him to live a very healthy life for 25 years. So in that sense of the word, we have a cure for AIDS. What's the problem then? Why is AIDS rampant in sub-Saharan Africa? Not because we don't have medication to send to sub-Saharan Africa, but because there are greedy pharmaceutical companies that won't sell at a reduced rate to sub-Saharan Africa. They want to charge Africans with AIDS the same amount that Magic Johnson is paying for his drug cocktail. So the problem is not money needed for research. The problem is the materialism and greed of American society that will not send medication that will save people's lives over to sub-Saharan Africa. So the question is, if the problem is materialism and greed that leads to the death associated with the AIDS pandemic, can you solve that problem with more materialism and greed? Right? So the AIDS pandemic it's going rampant in sub-Saharan Africa because of materialism and greed, and so we're going to solve the problem with a 10-year advertising-driven, materialistic, consumeristic campaign, and that's how we're going to solve the problem. You cannot create a new imagination with old symbols. You cannot create a new structure and system with an old narrative, with an old imagination. And that's what they tried to do with the Red campaign. And sometimes it feels like that's what we're trying to do with the church in America. We've got systems going and we're saying these are new systems. These are new structures. These are new ideas that we have. We are postmodern and not modern. We are urban, not suburban. We are, forward thinkers, not like that previous boomer generation. We're the millennials and the Gen Xers with new ideas, new systems and new structures. We're trying new things. But if you have the same diseased, dysfunctional imagination, that system will be just as faulty as the system built in the previous generation. So let's not have the arrogance to say, we're trying to do new things, but if the existing theological imagination is the diseased, warped one that drove the previous generation, we will make the same mistakes that were made in a previous generation. So we might want to challenge the status quo, challenge the existing systems. But if the narrative remains untouched, you will just form new systems that has the same narrative in place. So here's an example, and this is what we're going to develop going forward. Actually, are my slides up? How can I advance these slides? Can we go to about the third slide? Peter Berger and Thomas Luckman have a thesis about how social systems get formed. And they point to three different ways that social structures get formed: internalization, institutionalization, and externalization. Actually, externalization is probably the first one here. But what they point to is that systems don't just pop up. There are influences that form and shape these structures and systems. Individuals come into a system and externalize their values. That shapes the system. The system takes on a life of its own and has a character and personality of its own. That shapes the system. But then the system, because it has a life of its own, begins to shape those who come into the system. Internalization, that shapes the system. So we have these very complex systems and structures that form. Now, one thing that Berger and Luckman didn't talk about as much, but others picked up on, especially the work of Walter Wink, Stephen Mott, and others, is to identify that these systems, in order to perpetuate, need fuel. And the fuel is the narratives, the social theological imagination that keeps these systems going. The problem, as I said earlier, is that you may have a dysfunctional system, and you may tear down that system, but if the narrative is still in place, a new system will take its place that follows that dysfunctional narrative. So we had a system of slavery in America. That system of slavery was driven by white supremacy. The belief that whites were superior to blacks, therefore you can own blacks as slaves. That system, thankfully, was destroyed. But the narrative of white supremacy remained. And so even though the system of slavery was torn down, what took its place? Jim Crow laws. And Jim Crow laws is a new system that is different from the system of slavery, but the narrative of white supremacy still drives both of those systems. Now, we have a civil rights movement, and that tears down the Jim Crow laws. But what takes its place? The new Jim Crow. Mass incarceration, voter suppression. The things that we see are new systems, but they are still playing the old mediating narratives of white supremacy. So we can say we're going to tear down the system and build a whole new one. We're going to tear down this system and build a new one. But if the narrative remains untouched, if the driving imagination is untouched, then the new system will be just as corrupt and broken as the old one. Meet the new boss, it's the same as the old boss. Slavery is gone, Jim Crow is here. Jim Crow is gone, the new Jim Crow is here. All along, the mediating narrative of white supremacy has remained and will continue to build new systems along the way. So one of the questions I want to ask is, how are we going to fight evil in its proper geography? This is the work of Stephen Mott, who says that we are fighting evil in the wrong places at times. Walter Wink points to this as well. Says that our battle is not against flesh and blood, but our battle is against the powers and principalities. And our geography then requires, our understanding of the geography of evil requires not only an individualistic approach to confronting sin and injustice in the world, it requires a corporate structural approach. But also requires not only challenging the structures and systems, but challenging the existing mediating narratives. So I want to ask the question, even though we're saying we're building new systems, new church movements, and new church ideas, are we still buying into the dysfunctional theological imagination of white supremacy? Are we still operating under these assumptions of a dysfunction of white supremacy that still drives our systems, and no matter how much we try to build new systems, these systems are going to fall because, or are going to be broken because the narrative has remained the same? I'll give you an example of this. Go to the 5th slide if we could. The narrative around immigration. This is really fascinating to me because the stories around immigration right now, in the church especially, what we have seen is the dysfunctional narrative of white supremacy still operate, and now this just happens to be a new target. So here's what happens with immigration. 1965, as many of you know, there was a major change in the immigration laws in the United States. One thing that most people don't know is that what did not happen in 65 was an opening of the doors that said, let's let anybody and everybody in. That did not happen in 65. As part of the civil rights movement, racist laws in America that restricted immigration were struck down. The first of those racist laws was called the Chinese Exclusion Act. Can anybody guess what that might have done? Yeah, they weren't hiding anything here. We don't like Chinese people, let's exclude them. What should we call the act? How about the Chinese Exclusion Act? This was pretty straightforward. The Chinese Exclusion Act was the first of these. There was a series of these laws that said, we don't like people from a certain part of the world, we don't like the color of their skin, we don't like the shape of their eyes, so we're going to exclude them and judge them purely by their physical characteristics and exclude them, have laws that expressly ban them from coming into the United States. Now, we don't do that anymore. We're a much more mature nation. We stopped doing that many, many years ago. But in 1965, those laws were overturned, part of the civil rights movement, and said it's racist to say we're going to exclude just Chinese people. We're going to exclude just this group of people. So in 1965, what did not happen was, let's let anybody and everybody in. Let's go from 200 immigrants to 6 million immigrants. That has never happened. This opening of the doors to massive immigration has never happened in U.S. history. Correction. It happened one time when Columbus showed up and the Native Americans said, yeah, why don't we let them in? We won't worry about it. We won't have border control. We'll just let anybody and everybody in. And they said, what could go wrong? So the mythology, the fake news out there is that you have this massive flood of immigrants who are trying to crash our borders. That's not true. It's just not true. So if we go to the next slide, one of the things that happened in immigration patterns is not that in 1964 you had 200,000 immigrants, and in 1966 you had 6 million immigrants. Again, that's never happened. In 1964, you had 200,000 immigrants. In 1966, you had 225,000 immigrants. And then in 67, you have 228,000 immigrants. Gradual, incremental change in the number of immigrants. The major thing that changed was not the number of immigrants, but the distribution of immigrants. The distribution of immigrants changed because you overturned these racist laws. So what you have not seen is a massive flood overnight of 6 million immigrants show up. No, it's been a slow, incremental increase in the number of immigrants as well as the distribution of immigrants. In fact, if you're a Filipino and you're in the Philippines and you petition to come to the United States through the legal channels, you're put on a list. Do you know how long you have to wait to be taken off that list to come legally to the United States? 25 to 35 years. That's how long the waiting list is to immigrate from the Philippines. This is not, let's throw the doors open and let anybody and everybody in. This is a slow, incremental change in the immigration process. Now, actually, go back to the previous slide. That slow change has taken root in America, not because of immigration, but because of birth rates. So the birth rates began to change the dynamics of America. By 2008, a third of the US population was already non-European. By 2011, the birth rate shifts over into the major change where half the births in America are now of non-European descent. Now here's interesting. 5 years later, after the birth rate changes, what else changes 5 years later? The incoming kindergarten class changes. Very logical, right? 5 years later, after the birth rate changes, the incoming kindergarten class changes. And of course, that accelerates so that by 2023, that is 5 years away, the majority of all children in America are going to be of non-European descent. And of course, by 2042, maybe even a little closer, a little later, depending on the projection, somewhere in the decade of the 2040s, maybe at the latest 2050, we're going to see all of American society be of non-European descent. So what does this mean? It means that a narrative of white supremacy looks at these numbers and starts freaking out and say, we have got to build a wall. We got to build a wall because we're terrified of what this might mean. I say, go ahead and build a wall. In fact, I'll one-up you. Build a dome. Canada will pay for us to build a dome. We will seal off the United States of America. Nobody gets in or out. Guess what? These numbers will still hold. Because the browning of America is not based upon immigration, it is based upon birth rates. And you could either run away and flee from that and say, this is not what God intended for America, or say, thanks be to God, this is exactly what God is doing in the midst of American society and in our cities and in our world. This is a new narrative. So the new narrative means a new imagination must be in place. So we can jump to whose gaze. I think it's about the 9th slide. The problem is, again, the existing imagination. The existing imagination not only of white supremacy, whose perspective is the most important perspective. Whose perspective or point of view determines how the rest of society operates. So here's an example that I'm drawing from my mentor, my academic mentor, Willie Jennings. He lays it out, and then I'm going to take it to another step here in the analysis. There are a quadrilateral relationships, the black male relationship to the white male, the black male to the white female, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to focus on 2 of these. The white male's relationship to the black male. When the white male gazes upon the black male, how is the black male perceived by the white male, and how does that change how all of society views the black male? For example, the most dangerous human being in America, according to the 6 o'clock news, is the unidentified black male. Because the unidentified black male, when the white male sees the unidentified black male, that person is a threat. Because the unidentified black male, according to the 6 o'clock news, was involved in a drive-by shooting on the west side of Chicago. An unidentified black male stabbed someone on the north side of Chicago. An unidentified black male was involved in a gang fight in the south side of Chicago. This unidentified black male is somewhere between 15 and 45 years old, approximately 5'7" or 6'8" tall, weighing from 150 to 350 pounds. If you have seen such a black male, you must call the authorities immediately, because this black male is a threat to our safety. And that's why a 12-year-old kid playing in a playground, because he's an unidentified black male, automatically becomes a threat. That's why an 18-year-old, I don't care he's 6'4" and 300 pounds. That actually makes him less of a threat. If you're that far away and you're running at me, I can run the other way a lot faster. And especially if I'm 6'5" and 275 pounds, that's an 18-year-old kid. But he's an unidentified black male, so I need to put as many bullets into him as possible. the threat of the unidentified black male. Now, the other category is just as troubling because what we expect because of the gaze of the white male dominating the worldview, we want the black male to be the pet, the rap star that entertains us, the athlete that makes us feel good about our city. We want the black male to be a pet. The great theologian / prophet, Dave Chappelle. Yeah. What did Chappelle do? He walked away from a $30 million contract from Comedy Central. Why? He didn't say it in these words, but I'm going to put words in his mouth. He said, "You're not making me your pet." He pointed out that every strong black male comedian in Hollywood eventually shows up in drag. You can be Eddie Murphy, who's supposed to should have won an Oscar. No, he has to dress in drag. Martin Lawrence, one of the toughest guys, shows up. Even Wesley Snipes, one of the toughest guys in Hollywood, in order to save them from being a threat, that you put him in a dress and now he is a pet. And in fact, the worst thing is when the pet starts moving into threat territory. So you might have won or led your team to the Super Bowl, but the second you take a knee, you're not our pet anymore, so you are a threat, and we must never let you back into the NFL. You may be the great hip-hop, reformed, theologically accurate hip-hop artist. The second you put a tweet out there that shows that your family's heritage is one of slavery, you are no longer the pet that white America loves. You are now a threat, and you must be removed from white American evangelicalism. The pet and a threat. Now, here's the ultimate threat, by the way. The ultimate threat of the black male is when the black male looks at the white female. Emmett Till, case in point. Emmett Till, by the way, didn't even look at the white female. She accused him of that. That was enough. There was no evidence of that, but that was enough. Chicago kid goes to the South, hangs out with family. A white woman accuses him of looking at her or whistling at her. That was enough to get him killed, lynched, murdered. Such a grotesque image that it caused a sensation throughout the United States to say, is this what we're like? But the idea was that especially when the black male threatens the white female, that's the ultimate threat, and that person must be removed. That's why it was not an accident that the current president opens his campaign for president by saying Mexicans are rapists. That was not an accident. That was not a slip of the tongue. That was not even a dog whistle code. That was an explicit way of saying these people are a threat, not only to the economy, not only to your livelihood, they are a threat to white women. What is the imagination that is in place that fuels our dysfunctional systems? Again, I ask, does this also take place in our churches? Are these the dysfunctional imaginations that take place in our churches? So I want to give you the history of the way the churches are viewed, especially urban ministry. So when I started doing teaching courses on urban ministry, and I was an urban pastor for many years, started collecting books on urban ministry, I noticed some very interesting patterns about urban pastors' books. I want to walk through them with you. The first pattern is the beginning of this idea of America as a place where our cities are going to be the new Jerusalems and the new Zions. It begins with John Winthrop's sermon at the Massachusetts Bay. He looks over Boston and he says, I envision a city set on a hill where the gospel of Jesus will go forth from these urban centers. That's a narrative that stays throughout American history for several hundred years. The idea of Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Chicago as cities set on a hill. Boston is very serious about this because one of the major neighborhoods is called Beacon Hill. One of the main streets is called Beacon Street. The idea of these urban centers, American cities as cities set on a hill. But something changes. Black folks start moving into the cities. Immigrants start moving into the cities. And now these cities are no longer Zions and Jerusalems. They are now Babylons. They are now broken cities. In fact, if you start looking at the urban titles, they are the secular city. Go to the next slide. They are unheavenly cities. They are Babylon by choice. These are all books that started coming out in the 60s and 70s. After African Americans and immigrants started moving in, whites started moving out, moving to these suburban areas. That's why so many of the mega churches over the last 50 years are in the suburbs, not in the city. That's why so many of the Christian colleges and seminaries are in the suburbs and not in the city, because the city are sick with pathology and psychology that is messed up. Let's go to the next slide. Home is a dirty street for those who live in the city. Next slide. Is there hope for the city? So now all this time in the 60s, 70s, and even into the 80s, you were seeing this narrative of cities are broken. Why? Because black folks moved in. Part of the great migration from the south to the north. Cities are hopeless. Why? Latinos have moved in. Asians have moved in. Actually, it goes further. Italian Catholics have moved in. Greek Orthodox have moved in. Polish Jews have moved in. Our cities are changing. They are no longer the haven for white Anglo-Saxon purity. There is an imagination that says they are no longer Jerusalem, they are Babylons. But then something else changes again. If indeed those cities are Babylon, and we are building Jerusalems out here in the suburbs with our mega churches and our clean parking lots and our beautiful buildings, then that city needs our help. And when the question is there hope for the city? Yes, we've got to bring these churches back into the city. Go to the next slide. They're going to dare to love the ghetto. White folks are going to dare to love the ghetto. Go to the next slide. They're going to take up the urban challenge to reach the cities with the gospel. We're going to take our cities for God. Go to the next slide. We're going to raise up apostles to that broken down Babylon of a city, and they're going to be change agents for these cities. Go to the next slide. We're going to unleash white pastors in skinny jeans. They're going to be unleashed. And they're going to be an unstoppable force in the cities, because greater things are going to happen in the city. Greater things have yet to come. Greater things are yet to happen in the city. Yay, 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 yay. Follow that imagination with me. Follow that narrative with me. The cities are broken because there are people of color there. The suburbs are Jerusalems and Zions because that's where the white folks have fled. Now it's time to go save that poor Babylonian city. Now it's time to bring the hope of Zion and Jerusalem into the urban city and bring hope into that brokenness, because nothing has happened before, but greater things are going to happen now when white pastors in skinny jeans show up in these urban contexts. What is the narrative that is still at play, even though we claim that our systems are being broken down? How do we respond to this? We create new narratives. We create new narratives. And I'm not talking about changing the gospel. I'm not talking about changing our theology. I'm talking about new narratives that shape a new imagination. And that's one of the reasons I said lament is an important part of the changing of the imagination. I write about in my book, Prophetic Lament, that we are so poor at lament in American society that we have ended up with a people that are so exceptionalistic and triumphalistic that we don't understand that we are actually broken in need of God. That's a very basic theological concept. But because we are so overwhelmed by our sense of exceptionalism, we are Jerusalems, we are an exceptional nation, we are a wonderful American greatness, all of that stuff, that we have forgotten that we are broken people that need to cry out in desperate lament and need God desperately. So part of my studies has been about the worship life of the American church, overwhelmed with exceptionalism and triumphalism, unable to engage in lament. I did one of the studies that I did, or my TA did, was to look at the 100 most popular contemporary Christian worship songs to try to figure out, are there any laments in our contemporary worship songs? Turns out that of the top 100 most popular contemporary worship songs, 5, maybe 10 of our songs are songs of lament. We don't talk about lament in the church. We don't engage in lament in the church. We are so triumphalistic that we have dismissed this important spiritual practice. This is needed to change our imagination. I'll close with this. My commentary is on the book of Lamentations. And one of the things was, again, trying to note how many of you in this room have ever heard an entire sermon series on the book of Lamentations? Yep, that's about right. 1 or 2. And it's one of my students back there that raised his hand. The first sermon series that I gave in my church plant in 1996 was on the book of Lamentations. I was serving a significant, very bright group of students. They were MIT, Harvard alumni. They were at the top of their class. That's why they were there. They were doing, brilliant young men and women. And what they did coming into the city was this triumphalistic perspective. We're going to save the city, help the city. And what was needed was a dose of reality and a movement of lament in order to balance that sense of exceptionalism and triumphalism. So I did that sermon series, and then many years later wrote this book on the Book of Lamentations. One of the key things that I think I've learned out of the Book of Lamentations is how important it is that lament engages the breadth of voices. This is the new imagination that replaces the old imagination. There's questions about, if we can put up the slide, there's questions about who wrote the Book of Lamentations. The first option has been, I know I'm running late, my apologies. The first option is that it was Jeremiah. Jeremiah was probably the only candidate because, as you know, in the exile, all those who could read or write, all those with leadership skills, all the young men especially, were taken away into exile. Those who were left were the widows, the orphans, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. And so there really is no candidate, because Lamentations has a literacy to it, who could actually write this book, except Jeremiah, who actually was allowed to stay behind. So in terms of who could write the book of Jeremiah, Lamentations, Jeremiah might be the only candidate who had the skills to write the book of Lamentations. However, if you compare the writing style of Jeremiah to the writing style of Lamentations, you can say there's no way the same guy wrote these two books. I compare it to, it's Shakespeare and Chance the Rapper. You got two great poets, but their writing styles are slightly different. They're both incredible poets, but they're going to be, there's no way you can look at a writing of Shakespeare, you can look at Chance the Rapper and say, yeah, that's the same guy. It's not. They're different styles of writing. You see that contrast in the book of Jeremiah and the book of Lamentations. So what's happening here? What's happening here is that Jeremiah is probably the only candidate who could write the book of Lamentations. But the reason why we don't think he wrote it is because he is not talking. He's writing the words down, but he gets out of the way so that the voices of the women, the children, the marginalized, the sick, the lame, the crippled, and the blind, their voices rise up. In fact, one of the things I say about the book of Lamentations is that it is maybe the most feminine book of the Bible, because you see the voices of women rise up. Jeremiah moves out of the way and allow the voice of women to rise up. Allow the voice of the oppressed to rise up. And if there's something I can say to the evangelical church right now, sometimes to these leaders, just get out of the way. Just shut up and get out of the way. Reflect the voices of the women, the children. And especially for the evangelical church, we have got to shut up and listen to the voice of women much better than we are doing right now. We are losing a huge understanding of the gospel when we silence the voice of women. Get out of the way and let those who are the marginalized, the sick, the lame, the crippled, and the blind, let those voices rise up. And that will be my challenge to you. When you're seeking a new movement, you need a new imagination. You need a new way of thinking about the world, because the old way of thinking about the world is just going to rebuild the systems that were dysfunctional in the first place. So I talk a lot about my mom and the way that she has shaped me. My mom is now in her 80s. She is in the stages of dementia and Alzheimer's, and she is not as sharp as she used to be. But she gave a lot to my family in order for our family to succeed in this world. She worked long hours at an inner city carryout in Baltimore. She worked a night shift at a nursing home in inner city Baltimore. We lived in a very rough neighborhood, and my mom sacrificed so much so that our family could get out of the hood. And so because of her sacrifice, all four of her children are in Christian ministry or Christian education of some kind. But right now, she's not as well as she was many years ago. But many years ago, when she was in her 60s, she showed me the condition of her knees. And what I noticed, and she pointed out, was most human beings have one kneecap on each knee. She has 5 kneecaps on each knee. Because she has been praying for her children and for her community for 40, 50 years of her life, nonstop. Every day, she gets on her knees on a hardwood floor, her kneecaps cracked open to conform to the shape of the floor. So even now, as she prays, even though her mind is not fully there, she still kneels before God, and she feels her kneecaps crack open as she kneels before God. Here's the problem: her story is never told anywhere. We want to hear the story of the next hotshot pastor who's going to save the world. We want to hear the next new ministry idea that's going to save the world. And I say it's those broken knees that is where the kingdom of God is found. A new imagination will form new social systems, a new theological sense of imagination, a new narratives that are going to be formed. You all are going to be doing that. I would challenge you to keep up that good work and not give up the good fight. Thank you very much.